Hello, everyone, and everyone on the screen. It's great to be here. It's great to be back. So I'm going to apologize in advance. I'm exhausted after teaching this class, and so I have a whole thing I could say, but I think I'm just going to speak from the heart and just see what wants to come through. So today was the last day of the class, Men, Masculinity, and Extremism. And so it was actually a 4-day journey. And in those 4 days, in the first day, we talked about really the landscape, the ugly, of what does radicalization of American men and boys look like today. And from everything from mass shootings to violence to incels, we just really provided a landscape of the hate, the hate, the manifestations, and what this actually looks like. Students were able to get this sense of what is the terrain. Then on the second day, we got under the hood, and we said, once we looked at what is the state of the state in America for American men and boys, what are the psychological drivers and cultural influences that are radicalizing American men and boys? On the third day, we then talked about the systems. How do these systems in our landscape inform and radicalize? And then today, we talked about what are our feelings towards those men who are vulnerable to radicalization, and how do we have compassion? So what I want to talk about today with you all, I was a professor this morning and now as a minister, talking about the psycho-spiritual things that I couldn't say in the class. And so I want to bring some of that forward. So I want to go back to day 2. And I often call this I always say, imagine a stew. And imagine the ingredients in that stew, which make up the ingredients to radicalization and what are contributing to men and boys being radicalized. And so I often start with outdated models, faulty teachings, toxic conditioning, and then we go emotionally, deep-seated fear, shame, untouched grief, unresolved grievance. And then we move to manifestations of ways that I may lose hope. And when I move, it becomes dangerous when I go from this place of at least having some semblance of hope to being hopeless. And then you combine that with a fear or feeling of not mattering. And then, as I often say, I call this the hype effect on men and culture. Hate, isolation, polarization, and extremism. But the isolation is often what is part of the key ingredient. And so when men and young men are alone with their computers and the algorithms are coming in to amplify their grievance, this is when it becomes this combination. And so when we look at the stew, it's then understanding how many men and young men are vulnerable to radicalization. On if we look politically, on the right and on the left. What is that line that goes from a belief system to extremism to violence? And that's what we looked at this weekend. And then we looked at, what are the cultural norms, the expectations, definitions of masculinity, the constriction that comes with what are we allowed to do, what are we not allowed to do, what are we rewarded for, and what are we penalized for as men that can constrict us into narrower versions of ourselves. And so my work as someone who's an organization development practitioner interfaith minister, and doing this work with men and a capacity to hold men in their hate. And so from a spiritual standpoint, I'm often challenging myself and others, how do we bring love to hate?
Sean, can I interrupt a second? Somebody put a note about increasing the volumes. They may not be able to hear you.
Okay. Put this on. Oh. All right. Thank you. No, that's great. Is that better? Okay, right. So this idea of bringing love to hate, and thinking about in my interactions with extremists, and so I have, today I was giving a case of one of the first neo-Nazis and part of the skinhead movement that really amplified the skinhead movement in America, who was recruited at 14 by one of the founding members. And he, at 14, was recruited out of a place of anger, out of a place of loneliness, and out of a place of not really being able to really find his place or his voice, and that vulnerability. He moved up the ranks quickly, especially after the founder was sent to prison. And he was helping to lead and build this movement through about 22, so from 14 to 22. Then he met someone, he had a child, and he started to have challenges to his ideology, and he got out of the movement. And for 20 years, he's been bringing guys out of the movement and out of extremism. And one of the things we explored was, and I've met Christian, and we said, okay, what would we do at the 22-year-old version when he's fully down the rabbit hole? Versus what could we do for that 14-year-old boy that was confused? And what are the ways of intervention? And what does that look like? And so when I brought that in today, the question for so many of the students, one of the exercises we did was we said, what is your emotional state? Like realistically, without judgment. How many of you are experiencing, as you talk about and think about men who are on the path to radicalization? How many of you are experiencing anger? How many of you are experiencing fear? How many of you are experiencing sadness, indifference, and compassion? And the room really sat with what their emotions were. And in order for me to do this work, I call myself often a CSO, a covert spiritual operative, bringing the message of love, compassion, and deeper humanity into the systems who need it the most, where I know there's going to be a larger number of men who've been radicalized or who are holding on to very extreme ideas and views. And so from that place, part of the way I can do this is holding compassion and really separating. And I was in a relationship as well where I was in a relationship with someone who was on the path to radicalization. And in that experience, I had to ask myself, how do I see the humanity of this person? And how do I, even if I hate the views, and how do I separate the humanity from the views? And how do I get what I call compassionate curiosity to understand where those views came from? And at the same time, where do I seek to see the humanity, the love that this person has? Because I think a lot of times when I talk to folks who are on the path to radicalization, often their view is that they are doing it in light of love. They don't realize there's hate. And I think that's the complexity. I think one of the things that really came out of this week, these sessions, for my students as well as for myself, was really seeing the complexity. This is so much in the gray, it's not black and white. And, in doing this work, I am often, bringing in a curiosity to really understand the story, where the person is coming from, and how they got there, even if I don't agree. And what I often say is I hold my values and beliefs in my back pocket so I don't lose them, but I don't lead them so I don't lead with them so I don't lose the person in the conversation. And I hold a sense of grounded presence and grounded neutrality. Because I think in this polarizing world we're in right now, often if someone says something controversial, they're ready for the fight. But if we move from the fight to curiosity, and to be able to validate the humanity without validating the views, that has become part of the mix that I've really been able to see there's hope and there's pathways to healing and transformation. And so I have to hold that. And you know, I founded an initiative called Project Compassion to deepen compassion in police departments back in 2020. And in that work, we actually had a meeting with Senate staffers on the Judiciary Committee the week after the Uvalde shooting. And as we were meeting, our conversation in 30 minutes revolved around men's mental health, mass shootings, gun violence, police shootings, police suicides, and veteran suicides. And it really showed me how much suffering happens in silence, and at the same time, what is the deeper yearning? And I think going from a psychological to a psycho-spiritual, a lot of this work for me has been around looking at what is the deeper yearning, what is the suffering, and where's the opportunity for hope. And so I often say I meet guys in their suffering, I listen for their yearning, and I offer hope in the midst of both. And that's often a place that I find there is opening and opportunity. And what I'm going to leave, what I want to connect back to. So over the last 10 years that I've been doing this work, and I often call my work masculinity at the edges. And so I seek out, my question is often, how do we engage the hardest to reach men and the hardest to access systems to discover new models that can apply to all men across cultures that will help us humanize systems. And when I play, and I call this lessons from the edges. And so these are just a few things I've noticed and observed through the work I've been doing. One, that men will assess conditions before they engage. And so we're often saying, is this resistance or is it just feeling out, you know, is this safe without consequence for me to be vulnerable, for me to show my truth? Two, invitation and permission matter more than instruction. So how we invite, how we give permission to be vulnerable is a critical piece. And I often say the inner work never changes, but the invitation has to be modulated to the audience. For a lot of these guys, psychological safety is not about being comfortable. It's about not getting burned, not being ridiculed. And I think in this we talk a lot about the power of humiliation and wanting to avoid being humiliated or seen as weak. Shame drives silence, defensiveness, and performance. And I think we often talk about fear or anger. We don't talk enough about shame in the equation. That may be, often coming from New York, the third rail. That can be, you know, I'm not going to touch that. And so being able for us to think about how do we navigate this with men around shame. Resistance is often a credibility test, not defiance. So the resistance is often if I just put my toe out a little bit, am I going to get pushed back or not? And when I find out that I'm not getting pushed back, I'm going to put another toe in. But that resistance can be just an automatic defense to make sure, like, protecting what is necessary. Men will engage when their agency is respected and their curiosity is activated. You know, when I was writing my book, Warrior Compassion, I started noticing that people were writing the hashtag wounded, not broken. And the book was really given permission to say, in my philosophy, men are not broken, and I'll never say that men are broken. But men are often wounded because we're human. But we often don't have the tools or the access, or we have stigma that prevents us from seeking the help. And when we navigate. Men take cues about vulnerability from other men they trust and respect. And so the modeling is key. Masculinity is shaped more by systems than by beliefs or values. And so how these systems, family systems, faith systems, I spend a lot of time talking with folks about religious trauma and how that can define what masculinity should be. And as I talked about the hype effect, hate, isolation, polarization, and extremism, it often grows where boys and men feel unseen, unnecessary, or humiliated. And when we rely on prescription instead of inquiry, the unspoken truths of men stay hidden. And proximity requires the stomach, the will, the skill, and the credibility to unearth the realities of men. And by that I mean, and I'll end with this. As I do the work and as I invite others to do the work with me, I ask, do you have the stomach to work across ideological difference without flinching? Do you have the will? And asking yourself honestly, when it comes to men, do you love men? Do you fear men? Or do you have contempt for men? Are you trying to fix men, or do you want to stand with men in their healing? Depending on that answer, that's going to create a very different perspective of how you do this work with men. The skill. Do you understand dude psychology, which is not the clinical kind, but like the real kind, the complexity and universality of men, along with individual healing and transformation, group process, and systems, and understanding the systems that men are in relationship to. And last, the cred. Can you stand in front of these men and be taken seriously? And so as I think about this work, and as I think about the work of being a covert spiritual operative, I put the Parker Palmer passage on there because I think there's something about the shy soul. And we often underestimate the sensitivity of men. And if we go in bruising and bustling, we're going to scare the shy soul away. But when we come from a place of grounded neutrality, compassion, curiosity, and love, those become door openers to engagement in ways that you don't even think possible. Yeah.
Ask if there are any questions.
Are there any questions?
Any questions in the room? I'll walk the microphone.
I'll ask a question. Can you give some examples of things that have come up in your work?
There you go. Say that again.
Can you give some examples of implementing some of the things you talked about that have come up in your 10 years of working with men?
Yeah, I think some of this. When it comes to extremists themselves, it's like I'm not going to go to a Proud Boys meeting, or I'm not going to go to an Oath Keepers meeting. I often say I go to where these guys work and where they worship. So I pick organizations where where it plays out. And also I work with a lot of evangelical pastors. And what does it look like in evangelical, more far-right conservative places? I remember I was on a podcast once, and so I opened up, and I'm a queer progressive New Yorker, and the guy's like, but Sean, I'm an evangelical conservative in Montana. How are we going to do this? I said, well, we just named it, so let's just jump in. And we had some real honest conversations, and at the end of the discussion, tears were even shed on the podcast. And he said, I don't know what you did, man, but whatever you did, I've shared more with you on this podcast than I've shared with anyone else. And we still are friends today and looking at doing work in Montana with the men in his evangelical community. Another example, I met someone who wanted to be the face of the white power movement. And in our conversation, I noticed my body going into like automatic breath work, like involuntary, like I just went into a different zone. And there was a certain point when I just could imagine. I said, there's a table in front of me, and I just said, man, I can hold your hate. Just tell me what you hate. Get it out of you. And it was sort of like this alchemizing of, as he was giving me everything he hated, I just kept pushing back with love and sort of alchemizing it through my questions. And he gave me his hate for 20 minutes. 20 minutes of, I hate this, I hate that, I hate this, I hate these folks. And at the end of that conversation, after he was done, I said, I just got one question for you. What's in your heart? Where's the love? Where's the fear? Where's the hate? And he said, I don't have any hate. I said, okay, let's go back over the last 25 minutes. He said, well, I might have some hate. I said, okay, let's just focus on that. What is that about? And where did that come from? And we started having these conversations, and he kept coming back. I'm like, why do you keep coming back? We're not on the same page. He's like, I like how you think, and you're not reacting, and you're not responding. You're not making me feel wrong. You're actually seeing me. And I think that's part of the mix, is when we can really see each other and get beneath the views and the politics and all the ways we think we're different, and get to, what is our humanness, and can I see you in your humanity? And I found that's like often a door opener to be able to make progress with the person.
I have a few questions in the chat. One from Alpha. I don't know if you can read them or if you would me to read.
Okay. So I see one. Where do we encounter such persons, and do they include females? Typically, I have not. I have encountered females that eradicate hate. And often they are coming from far-right extremist families, and they have been given the value system, and they realize when they escape hate, or life after hate, as they'll often say. But it's often come from either from the folks I've met, from their families or from their spouses. And then they're introduced in. Where or how do you draw the line between making space for their ideology and tolerating hate which causes real harm? So I often say that when we talk about DEI, when we talk about social justice, when we talk about righting and justice, when we talk about accountability for harms done, I often say I'm the prep course to that work. So before someone can even see maybe how they are in a conversation around accountability for harms done, we have to strengthen the ego. And so to be able to do some of the compassion work, the inner work, that can often prepare. So for me, it's never a if. It's never a choice between the two. It's always a when. How does one body of work lean into another body of work to be able to support the healing work and the impact that it's had on others. But sometimes I think and I often will say, in our pursuit of righting injustice, we forgot about one thing, the male ego. And we're often telling versus inviting or engaging. And so it's like having patience is having tolerance, in that line. Like I said, I keep my values and beliefs in my back pocket. So if it crosses a line that either the hate is too much, or it's destructive, or it's going to create harm, then that's going to be a different conversation. But for the most part, just even having someone verbalize to someone that's not like them can often be healing. Where or how have you seen the role of Christian nationalism in this radicalization? We were talking about that yesterday. We were talking about the role of faith communities. I think it's interesting on typically the progressive side, or even in progressive churches. To get guys to do anything, it's like we get excited about 10 or 15 guys. An evangelical Christian megachurch can get 1,000 guys in a men's revival weekend, and they're getting the dogma in addition. And so I think that's, I spend a lot of time talking about, from the pulpit, how are we talking about masculinity, and how are we talking about a number of these ideas that are embedded in Christian nationalism, and what is the effect. And so I think it plays out. And especially when I start to talk to folks who are evangelical, we start getting into dogma, we start getting into even the teachings of Christ, and even the archetype of Christ. I think what's interesting is I was talking to an evangelical conservative recently. He's like, yeah, man, we're not going to church anymore and he's like, I'm like, why? He's like, because of the feminization of the pulpit. The church has become the church that my wife goes to, and now we have no place to go. So we just stopped going. And so I think even within that, you've got, what is the role of faith? How is this movement, this idea of a masculinity that is not in line with Christ? And so you have a lot of openings. And for me, I see it as a complexity and a puzzle to try to understand, rather than be in black and white terms, around what's really happening for the person, what's happening in the system, and then what's happening in society. Thanks so much for your sermon and the work you are doing. How can we as a society help destigmatize men being vulnerable and create more spaces for men to be open about sharing their feelings? So when I lived in D.C., before I moved to Philly, I started something called Men's Soul Adventures DC. Outdoor adventure meets deeper male bonding meets soul connecting conversations. I didn't know how many guys would show up. Within 24 hours of launching, 52 guys signed up. Within 3 months, we had 180 guys. I went to 4 other cities, and we went from 180 to 330 men in 3 days. So I started asking questions. I'm like, I said, one, I said, so why did you come? Why a soul adventure? So a third of them said, I wanted a different type of adventure that sounded interesting. A third said, I wanted a deeper connection with men that went beyond the superficial. And a third of them said, I just want to have a space for deep conversations, and I have practical questions around spirituality and faith, but no place to go. And I don't want to go to a church. And so I started calling it practical spirituality for dudes. And I think within that, there's a couple of things that were coming up. One, this idea of church without walls. So where are the places that men can go and do something while still being able to bring in deep conversations? And so I think to destigmatize, we have to rethink how we're actually engaging. I think we have to rethink, what is actually going to gravitate, where will men gravitate? And, make it not feel like it's going to talk therapy. You know, I don't know how many guys don't want to go to a men's circle, but they will if they're working on a car or going and walking side by side or going on a hike. We'll talk about anything and everything, right? So I think it's just finding the right invitation. Next question. Have you engaged with men who are in far-right Christian groups that use biblical passages such as the Jews cried out, "Let his blood be on us and our children"? You Jews are from the synagogue of Satan, and other passages that justify their anti-Semitic beliefs? No. I can say that when I do talk to folks who are Christian, they're often coming from a place of love, and at the same time, or just their belief. I think what I find is not where the scriptures are weaponized. I find more so there's a rigidity in interpretation, or they only quote the book of Genesis, and then I realize, okay, they haven't looked at the Bible, they just know what they've been told. And so I think there's, but I do think, one of the things that I did in the class is I asked my students, one, let's just define some of these terms so we know what we're talking about. What do we mean by hate? What do we mean by extremism? What do we mean by radicalization? And what do we mean by polarization? So we're not just throwing terms around. And so I think when we're in these conversations, what I often find is from one person's value set, they may be coming from love and they're protecting something that just doesn't resonate with someone else's value set. And yet we're still calling it hate. And so I think there's an opportunity to level set language, to use language, and to really get curious. Are we saying the same thing? And from that perspective, there's an opportunity when we talk about scripture. Are we saying the same thing? Or even just how do we interpret? But in terms of these passages that are spewing hate, I haven't come across that.